Good morning, everyone. Let's officially begin our Friday reflections. My name is Peter Bolland. Welcome to San Diego Oasis, our weekly 30-minute gathering here every Friday, 10 a.m. West Coast time, for us to think back on our week and reflect into what we've been living through and barely surviving and thriving in, and all of the joys and sorrows of these wonderful, perplexing, baffling, rich, and wonderful lives. And it's a pleasure and an honor for me to spend this time with you every Friday. This is as I say every week, this is a real highlight on my weekly calendar, this chance to gather with you and think through some things. It's a wonderful island in the stream. I was going to say island in the storm, but I don't know, maybe things are feeling a little bit calmer for you. I got my first vaccine last weekend. Yay! Because I'm in education. I'm under 65, but I'm in education. So I found a through path through the weeds, as many of us are scrambling to find a gosh darn vaccination. I know if you're over 65, it's been easy, and many of you have received both of your vaccinations already. Yay! But my friends my age, early 60s and 50s and 40s, they're scrambling, and they're trying to get those shots. So little quick funny story. My wife heard through some colleagues at her job that if you go on CVS, the drugstore.com, you can register for a vaccine. But the only way it works is if you log on at midnight, because every night at midnight, they release the next batch of appointments for the next few days. And by the time you get out of bed in the morning, they're all gone because apparently there's this cadre of night hawks who swoop in and eat all the prey between the hours of midnight and dawn. So we set the alarm for 11:45 p.m. last night, and she got up and came over to the computer and logged in, and as soon as midnight hit, the new appointments popped up. She grabbed one. So yay, my wife Lori is now going to join my father, whose name is Hilbert. This is my middle name also, Hilbert Bolland. And I'm thinking about the nature of the self. Who am I? What am I? Who are you? What are you? And, Ramana Maharshi, the great Indian non-duality teacher, the guru of all the other gurus in the 20th century, Ramana Maharshi used to lead meditations around that question. And I know other teachers do that too. Let's meditate on the question, who am I? Or as Adyashanti puts it, what am I? And before you rush in with the answer of, I'm a lawyer, I'm a dad, I'm a mom, I'm a Republican, I'm a Democrat, before you rush in with a list of all the labels and all the tasks and the sociological roles and the identity qualities, what's underneath all those shingles, right? What's underneath all those layers? That's the roof, but we want to get to the heart of the house. Like, what's in there? What is that? So this is a perennial question in philosophy. And these questions, I've always been interested in them, but they came to a head, of course, and they became quite painfully real when my father was going through the last years of his life, afflicted by Alzheimer's. And I know many of you have intimate awareness of this as you witnessed your loved ones enduring this most humiliating of afflictions, where the entire self seems to dissolve. And so, and also because I'm working on this question with my students at Southwestern College this week, my Asian philosophy students, were studying Buddhism, and there's a particular idea in the teachings of Buddha called Anatman, or no self. In Hinduism, Atman is the universal consciousness that flows through us all. Brahmanatman is the changeless, birthless and deathless ground of being. So in Hinduism, the teaching is underneath all the layers of the onion, so to speak, inside of all of us is the Atman, which was never born, will never die. It's absolutely immutable and changeless. And that's what we foundationally and fundamentally are. So that's Hinduism's answer to the question, what is the self? But Buddha, being a Hindu, about 500 BC, when he went into his meditation and he said, I'm going to get down to my Atman. And what Buddha discovered, reported, and built his teaching around was the insight that when he went looking for the Atman, he couldn't find it. There was nothing there. And this is in many ways the big break between Buddhism and Hinduism. So that idea in Buddhism is called anatman. And it's like Greek. And when you put an A in front of a word in Sanskrit, it negates the word. So anatman means no atman, no self. This is the doctrine of no self or no identity. It's a kind of radical idea. It's not one we generally subscribe to here in the West, but it's an intriguing one, and I want to think about it with you a little bit today. Where does our separate sense of self arise when we were born into these bodies as infants and toddlers and so on? Well, I suppose that's kind of an obvious question. You come to discover that you're not the same as that kid or that kid because you have your own body and they have their own body. So it starts with our bodies, and then I have my own perceptions, what I see and hear and taste and smell and touch. And those perceptions you cannot have. We can talk about what I'm perceiving and what you're perceiving, but I seem to have this sort of private real estate here, and you have your private real estate. And I suppose that's where our sense of separateness comes from, our sense of identity. And then the ego begins to take form, the I, me, and mine, my pleasure, my pain, my bike, your bike. Let's not get them mixed up about whose bike is whose bike, and private property, and all that I, me, mine stuff comes out of that. But is there anything underneath all of those waves? That's the question Buddha went looking to try and answer. Is there anything beneath all those waves of a sense of a body, a sense of all my thoughts about, all my opinions about everything and all my sensations? What's beneath all that choppy surface water? Is there a stillness, a depth that abides? My father died 8.5 years ago on October 26, 2012. He was 90 years old, or was he 91? I'll have to do the math. Let's see, he was born in 22. Yeah, he was 90. Forgive me. He was 90. And so this October, it'll be 9 years since he's been gone. And he was afflicted the last 3 or 4 years of his life. It's hard to know when Alzheimer's begins, isn't it? Right? When you've lived through that yourself with your loved ones. And all of us who are of a certain age sort of joke about, senility, and, you notice your memory isn't as sharp, and there's sort of the natural decline of mental acuity, which is pretty navigable. But then there's full-on dementia, Alzheimer's, and so on, which of course is not so navigable. And so generally it became quite pronounced and unmanageable in the last 3 or 4 years of his life. He could no longer take care of himself. That starts to go because there's no memory of like how to comb your hair or how to brush your teeth and all that bathroom stuff. And how to dress and how to present yourself, right? We're also practiced as adults in how to show up and all the social choreography. All that kind of starts to slip away. He would look at a clock and say, I don't know what time it is. I don't know what that thing is and what that thing is. And I'm not so clear on these numbers. And the whole scheme kind of went liquid for him. And so he couldn't read clocks, let alone make appointments, right? And he could not read anymore. He couldn't follow sentences and paragraphs. So you'd think in your dotage, in your wonderful, relaxing old age, you're going to read all the books, right? And study the newspaper. And he was an avid reader, and that no longer worked. He couldn't follow a thought in a sentence, in a paragraph, let alone a chapter, let alone a whole book. He couldn't even watch TV anymore at a certain point because he couldn't keep up with the dialogue and why a joke was funny in a sitcom, or he couldn't follow the narrative of a movie. And so a lot of people have said this about Alzheimer's, but he just started retreating back into his own memories. People with Alzheimer's in this advanced state often sit in a chair and they kind of just gaze into nothing, maybe out the window, maybe not. And they kind of live in their own movie. And when you engage with them, we found with my dad, and I think this is pretty common, we found that he was very willing to talk about things that happened, 70 years ago. All these great stories started coming up about his childhood in Indonesia. My father was born in Sumatra in Indonesia. His father was a part of the Dutch colonization of Indonesia. And there was a Shell Oil kind of village there, Shell Oil being a Dutch company. And they were, like oil companies do, going everywhere in the world. And, the word we use now is exploiting the indigenous people and sucking all the natural resources, leaving a few coins on the table and madly enriching themselves. And so my grandfather was a school teacher in a Dutch colony, teaching other Dutch kids of oil workers. And my dad and all of his siblings were born in Indonesia. He lived the first 17 years of his life there in the tropics with orangutans and stuff like that swinging from the trees. And volcanoes, So he had great stories about all of that, stories we'd never heard. And when he was 17, he came to the Netherlands in 1939, and right before Hitler invaded Poland and World War II descended. And he spent those horrible years in Europe, many of them in Nazi occupation of Holland, those 5 years from 40 to 45. And my dad, many of you have heard me share some of these stories before. My dad was taken as a 21-year-old, was taken by the Nazis to Germany to work as forced labor as a printer for the last 2.5 years of the war. And a lot of those stories started coming up in those last years of his life when he was 88, 89, 90. And he could no longer play piano. He was an avid piano player, so that skill went away. He could no longer take pictures. He was a photographer and a filmmaker, and all of those skills eluded him. He, of course, couldn't remember who I was, that came and went, and then it started to basically not come so much anymore, and it was just sort of gone. And he would kind of look at you with some vague sense of recollection. But, and this was, of course, most painful on my mom. They were married over 60 years and had been together through everything, coming to America and all of that. And so to lose her husband, like kind of one piece at a time like that, while also having to be his primary caregiver. I live 200 miles away. This is all happening in Ventura. And I'm living here in San Diego, and my other brothers are scattered. I have one brother in Ventura, and as always happens in caregiving for elders dynamics, one sibling gets the whole thing dumped on them, and the other siblings are sort of scattered around, kind of a common dynamic there. So it was as if, I guess, to connect these two things together, this curious theory, this Buddhist theory about the insubstantial nature of the self, the anatman idea, and Alzheimer's, the experience of Alzheimer's. It was as if, as I witnessed my father's decline and dissolution, it was as if bits and pieces of him were flying away one by one, as if the self is composed of a flock of birds sitting in a bare, empty winter tree, a leafless tree. The self is a flock of birds sitting in a leafless tree. And one by one, there goes a skill, there goes an ability, there goes a memory file. One by one, the birds fly away until finally, at last, only the empty tree remains. And that's really how it feels when you ride along with someone on the Alzheimer's journey. And from my perspective, it seems to perfectly affirm the Buddhist concept of self, that the self is not a fixed monolithic thing. It is an aggregate of processes that are kind of loosely interlaced throughout most of our life. Think of all the times that you and I have changed in our lives and set down or renounced or let go a really fundamental core part of our identity and kind of taken on a new identity, and then there's a sense of play around that even. So with that in mind, with the Alzheimer's example in mind, and with the analogy of the self as a flock of birds in a leafless tree, and they sit there in the tree for your whole life, but then if and when dementia and Alzheimer's comes, the birds start to fly off. And when all the birds are gone, you are left with a fundamental question: who is this person? And if you've lived through this Alzheimer's thing, I mean, it just struck me with great power and poignancy toward the end. I mean, who is this man? My father is gone. Everything I mean by the word father is gone. And this fellow sitting in front of me, who resembles my father, is in sort of every meaningful way not my father. He's in his body, but his body is also bears only a resemblance to who he was before. It just really brought to a head that whole kind of Buddhist idea. Now, I know this Buddhist idea of anatman flies in the face of the Western, mostly religious concept of the soul. The Judeo-Christian and Islamic sense that my soul is my soul and you have your soul, and my soul was created by God, and when the body dies, the soul goes on. And there's a permanence about the soul that is just missing from Buddhism. It's just a fascinating thing. And I'm not here to adjudicate who's right or wrong in these competing theories. It's just fascinating to raise these questions and to sit with them and to reflect. What would it mean if the Buddhist one were the more accurate one? What was particularly difficult, though, is that toward the very end, personality traits and behaviors emerged in my father that were utterly foreign to him. My father was a peaceful sort of poet, a poetic, spiritual, very gentle man. He didn't like football. He didn't like sports at all because he wasn't interested in anything that resulted in one team losing and the other team winning. He always felt bad. He didn't go fishing because he thought it was rather rude to put a steel hook in a fish's mouth and pull it out of its perfectly peaceful life and wrench it into a horrible death for fun and relaxation. Now, no disrespect to people who fish. I like eating fish, so thankfully people fish. But I'm talking about his temperament, right? He just wasn't drawn to that. Now, obviously, no hunting. And my dad was a vegetarian his whole life, which was kind of very unusual for me to be a kid in the 60s. And my mom and dad were vegetarians. And I was a vegetarian until I strayed and ate my first taco as a teenager and kind of never went back. But he became increasingly depressed and frankly pissed off about it. You know, those early kind of mid stages of Alzheimer's, when you know what's going on and it makes you mad. Now, toward the end, he was just sort of in a fog. There wasn't enough of him left to be mad and resentful about who he was no longer able to be. But in that middle stage, you can kind of see it all slipping away and you're like, oh, F this, you know, I ain't going quietly into that, you know, that Dylan Thomas poem, Rage or Rage Against the Darkness. That's the middle stage. And the self-harm, you know, my mom told the most chilling stories. Like she couldn't find my father one day when he was at home, and when he was still at home, I should say. And she went into the bedroom and he was sitting on the bed with a knife, the biggest knife in the kitchen. And he said, Amy, I just want to kill myself. I can't do this anymore. And when she tried to take the knife away from him, he lunged for her with the knife. and he's stronger than her. And these stories were, shall I say, worrisome to a son living 200 miles away, or the time when I called her in the morning and said, "How's it going?" She said, "Well, last night was a little rough. You know, your father got up to go to the bathroom about 3 a.m. and he fell behind the toilet. He like wedged between the toilet and the wall, and it's 3 a.m. and he's 88 and I'm 82 and I can't pick him up, and he's stuck back there and he's kind of moaning and crying and these horrific scenes that I'm hearing about on the phone." And she said, "I didn't know what to do. It's not quite up to the level of call the police, but I called the neighbors down the street, this beautiful couple, these two women that live down the street from my mom and dad. And they were both in the fire department. One of them was a fire captain, and she had befriended them and as a neighbor sometime in the past. And she had their phone number. She called them, and these two women, God bless them. I feel like I want to track them down. I never met them. I don't know their names. I don't know what house they live in. They rushed over. They got my dad unwedged from behind the toilet. So these kinds of indignities, right? And it became clear that my mom could no longer care for him. It was dangerous, and it was harming her, and perhaps could have resulted in tragedy. And she just flat out wasn't able to give my dad the care that he so richly deserved. And so as a family, we all decided we needed to put him in a memory care facility with round-the-clock care for his own well-being and safety. But that was another wrenching day, to put him in the car and say, "Dad, let's go for a ride," and not explain to him, "We're moving you to a lockdown facility." This stuff is, I told myself I was going to keep it together on this call today, and I am. But this is a front row seat, isn't it, on impermanence and on the suffering inherent in life. And yet, those last years of his life, he spent about 1.5 years in that facility, had their own beauties. They had their own beauties. I would go there and be with him, and I'd wheel him out in the wheelchair out in the garden. And I found a crow feather, and I would just, and I put it in his hand, and he grabbed a hold of it, and he grabbed it so tight. And by now he's nonverbal, right? And we would just sit, and we would just feel the air and look at the roses and feel this feather. And just to be together was enough. And there were beauties like that I'll never forget. And the caregivers there, God bless them. And then toward the end, the hospice process and the hospice workers, just these people are saints. And it reminds me then of this Buddhist question so much, because by that point, there wasn't anything left. There was just someone there breathing, sort of. And this is what Buddhism calls anatman. And the only reason we think we have a self is because we have a body, and we have perceptions, and we have thoughts, and we have drives, and then we have awareness of all of that. Those are called the 5 skandhas in Buddhism. And that's what gives rise to the separate sense of self. But in Buddhism, once you take away those things, the body, the mind, the perceptions, there's nothing left. It's that empty tree after all the birds have flown. There's just eternity. And eternity is captured for a moment and encapsulated and embodied in these wonderful and sort of amusing bodies for a short while. And then the disintegration comes, and eternity finally returns to itself, released. The Buddhism term would be dharmakaya. So I want to share one last story about my father. One of the many blessings of my life is my father. And after he was gone, and especially after my mother died a couple years later, going through all the stuff, yeah, And there was a journal that my dad kept when the first year that they moved from New Jersey to Ventura. I was 4 years old. It was 1963. Sorry, 62. Yeah, he moved in 62, but he started keeping a journal in 63. I mean, right there is the assassination of Kennedy, right, in November. So that whole year he kept a journal. And he was working at the Ventura Star Free Press. He was a printer. And my mom and dad had one car. And he would often, she would often give him a ride to work so she could use the car to run errands. And so my dad, after work, he got off work about 3 p.m, and the Ventura Star Free Press is in downtown Ventura. And it's just a few blocks to the beach. So he would walk down to the beach, and my mom would pick him up at Ventura Beach by the pier. And he would just walk along the beach. And I didn't know that about him. I'm 4 years old. What do you know about your dad when you're 4, right? Nothing. And he wasn't a man of many words. He didn't tell me a lot of stories our whole life. He was just a beautiful presence, not a big talker. And this journal he kept is a real treasure for me. It's mostly kind of mundane kind of diary stuff, like tonight we went to a Chinese restaurant, or we went to the drive-in movie and we saw this movie, or whatever, Ben-Hur or something, whatever movie was playing in 63. And I found this poem in his journal, and it opened up a whole new window for me into my dad. So he wrote this poem. It doesn't have a title. I call it Walking on the Beach because that's the first line. And he wrote it when he was 41 years old. So he's still a young man with a 4-year-old boy, me, a 12-year-old boy, and a 14-year-old boy, my brothers, John and Eric, and his wife, Amy, the 5 of us in a little home on Clemson Street. And he would go down and walk on the beach. And my dad was a spiritual man. And there were some books in the house that were clues, like Swedenborg and Krishnamurti. And when I went to college, my mom and dad would often go to hear Krishnamurti speak at the Crotona Institute in Ojai. And if you know Ventura, Ojai, Santa Barbara, if you know that region, growing up in Ventura, we would often go to Ojai on Sunday, just a great Sunday drive, beautiful village back in the hills. So this poem ties all of these threads together for me, all these things that you and I have been thinking through this morning. It's called Walking on the Beach. Walking on the beach, I feel nothing. Peace is all around me. I wonder, just by being here, is it eternity that found me? Waves are washing in, then out. Feet are frisked by fluffy foam. Hair is ruffled by the wind. Eternity became my home. I gently feel I've been invited. The wind, the surf, the distant sounds of breaking waves. There's no returning. Eternity, it's me you found. I feel like my father left a message for me with this poem of a mystical experience, of a non-duality epiphany. That there on the beach, it reminds me of that Zen saying, how refreshing the whinny of a pack horse, unburdened of everything. Everything just fell away from him. His name, his role, all of his social obligations, all of the boundaries became transparent, translucent. And there was just oneness. He's calling it eternity. And he describes it as an invitation. He didn't hunt it down and figure it out. The invitation just came unannounced. And he fell into it. And I think of that in light of how I lost my father in those final years of his life, of eternity returning to eternity. I'll read that last bit again. I gently feel I've been invited. There's no returning. Eternity, it's me you found. Thanks, my friend, for spending this time with me. I'll take us out, as I like to do, with the the Tibetan singing bowl. I'll see you on the other side. Bye.